Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the delay. We're still having our issues with our video, but we are working on that, and we are back. This is Letter to Philippi Live. We need to remove that our echo there. And that should do our echo. So welcome. This is Sean Emslie from Letter to Philippi Live. This is the Letter to Philippi Live daily broadcast. And we are broadcasting today. And we'll be looking at Philippians chapter 2, verses 8 today. And we will get started with, and we actually will start with the end of verse 7, and that works it into Philippians chapter 8, verse 2 of chapter 8. Chapter 2, verse 8. And we read, "And when he appeared as a human being, he humbled himself still more by becoming obedient even to death on a stake as a criminal." Yeshua's humility led to the execution stake, the cross. The sacrifice out of his love for the Father. Yeshua's intimate, ultimate act of humility and obedience to the divine plan was a self-sacrifice at the stake on the Roman cross. N.T. Wright, a biblical scholar, summarizes the extent of Yeshua's humility and obedience, where he wrote, this is from his book History, "The Christ's act of obedience clearly refers to his death. In particular, the scope of Philippians 2, 5 through 11 shows that it is wider, including the obedient and humble life which culminated in the cross." So right here is saying that this self-sacrifice of Yeshua was more than just the death on this cross, but his whole life committed to the divine plan. In the Messianic hymn, we see the dual nature of Yeshua that begins in his divine state, and then he humbly enters the world as a slave that would die on the Roman stake on the cross. And after this suffering would receive the divine name and be highly exalted. This dual role held by Yeshua unites the two major pictures of the Messiah. The Messiah ben David, the sufferings, the one who would be the reigning Messiah, the kingly, end of times ruler, and the Messiah ben Yosef, the suffering servant of Isaiah's servant songs, most notably Isaiah 53. The dual nature of Yeshua as the Davidic Messiah and as the divine royal king, and also the suffering servant that would give his life in an atoning sacrifice, can be seen in Midrash Rabbah, Ruth 5:6. It reads, "It refers to the Messiah. Come hither, approach to the royal state, and eat of the bread," refers to the bread of royalty, "and dip my morsel in the vinegar," refers to his sufferings, as it says, "But he was wounded because of our transgressions." In an unusual, even mystic way, Yeshua in his atoning death on the Roman stake on the cross served as both the sacrifice and the priest offering the sacrifice. As we see in the letter of the Messianic Jews, also known as Hebrews, where we read, this is from Hebrews 9, 11 through 14, "But when the Messiah appeared as Kohen Gadol, of the good things that are happening already, then through the greater and more perfect tent, which is not made of hands, that is not of this created world, he entered into the holiest place, once and for all, and entered not by the means of the blood of goats and calves, but by the means of his own blood, thus setting people free forever. For the sprinkling ceremonially unclean person with the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer restores their outward purity, then how much more the blood of the Messiah, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself to God as a sacrifice without blemish, will purify our conscience from the work that leads to death, so we can serve the living God. We see here in the book of Hebrews detailing of Yeshua being both the priest and the sacrifice for sins, that he served both as a sacrifice and the one bringing the sacrifice, that he is the great high priest and the great sacrifice. This unique priestly role that Yeshua performed also can be seen in the two messiahs of the Qumran community, the Davidic Messiah, common in Jewish Messianic expectations, but also a priestly Messiah. Though, as we will see in Yeshua, in contrast to the two messiahs of Qumran, Yeshua will embody both the priestly Messiah and the Davidic Messiah in his two comings. First is the priestly to redeem, and the second to eternally rule and reign in his soon return, which may it be soon. As we see in Hebrews, Yeshua also played the role of the divinely ordained sacrificial lamb that Paul will speak about in his letter to Corinth in 1 Corinthians 5:7. Paul is making the Philippians aware of the possible cost of obedience in modeling the humility of Yeshua. For followers of Yeshua and modelers of the Messiah, there is what Bonhoeffer called the cost of discipleship. The cost of following Yeshua can be seen earlier in the book when Paul said, "Because for the Messiah's sake it has been granted you not only to trust in him, but also to suffer on his behalf." And that's Philippians 1:29. Paul wanted the Philippians to understand that Yeshua, their Lord and Master, died the most humiliating death on their behalf. As E.P. Sanders wrote, Christ did not just humble himself, becoming meek and mild. He degraded himself, going as low as death by the crucifixion, the penalty meted out to rebellious slaves. Crucifixion was the most problematic for both Jews and for the Greeks and Romans. It was problematic for Greeks and Romans to understand that the Lord of the universe would be willing to die the worst death, the most humiliating death on their behalf, a punishment reserved for criminals who were not Roman citizens, a penalty for the lowest of criminals, and for slaves. This deep level of human humility that Paul is calling the Philippians to understand and pursue is the way modeled by their master. Though counter to the understanding of both Jews who were, of the Jewish people who saw the cross as scandalous, but also to the Roman world who saw the Gentile world who would see it would be a scandal that the great Redeemer would be the one who would die the death of a slave, the death of a criminal. We see that as it says, this is the greatest act of humility in the Messiah's death, is to be a point of unity for all followers of Yeshua. That this scandalous death, this horrific death, this death of great lowliness was to be the point of contact. All people who put their trust in Yeshua were connected by this death, by this scandalous death, this horrific death, this death that offered full atonement for both Jew and Gentile. Paul is taking the Philippians to the Messiah's death on the Roman stake here and shows them that the place where they can fully connect to the Messiah is to understand their connection to the Messiah came through his sacrificial death on the tree, on the Roman cross. And they're to understand that they're being called to emulate his humility, a humility that can and may lead for many of them to death. And we know that many of the early followers of Yeshua gave their lives for their witness to the Messiah, for their faith, trust in Messiah, cost them their very lives. And we'll step in actually okay, we can actually move on into verse 9. I thought I had more commentary on verse 8, but we'll continue going through the Messianic hymn. In verse 9 we read, "Therefore God raised him to the highest place and gave him the name above every name." In this verse, Paul uses the Greek word hyper ipsosin, which means super exalted or highly exalted. Paul here was showing that after his life and death as a slave on earth, Yeshua did not return just to his previous place of exaltation in heaven as the divine Son, but he returned to even higher level exaltation to now take his place as lordship over the whole created order, as will be seen in verse 10, that with his exaltation, now the Messiah of Israel has now been given the name of above all names, and that he is given the name that he is both the in his life on earth would now become the one who was super exalted. As the Messianic hymn seeks to teach Yeshua-like humility, it demonstrates that the exaltation of Yeshua was the outcome of his great act of humility, especially his self-sacrificial death on the Roman stake on the cross. In Targum Jonathan on Isaiah 53:10, we see the exaltation or rewarding with the spoils of a nation given to the Messiah because of his willingness to suffer death on behalf of the divine plan and for the forgiveness of sins. When we read, this is from Isaiah 53:10, the Targum Jonathan on Isaiah 53:10. "Then I will apportion to him the spoils of great nations, and he shall divide his spoils, the wealth of mighty cities, because he is ready to suffer martyrdom, that the rebellious he might subjugate to the Torah. And he shall seek pardon for their sins of many, and for his sake rebellious shall be forgiven." I'm in my class, Pop. Excuse me. Sorry for that break there, and I will be right back. Papa, I'm doing my class right now. Papa? Sorry for that. We had life that got in the way of... I should have a closed off set here. But we'll continue on. It was in this act of supreme humility that formed the basis from which Yeshua demonstrated his worthiness to exaltation of the highest place. Moreover, this exaltation represents the highest place of authority, which reflects Daniel's prophecy of the end of days in Daniel 7:13-14, wherein the Son of Man Yeshua is granted eternal universal rulership by the Ancient of Days, God the Father. The phrase, the name above every name. In speaking of the name above every name, Dr. Stern commented, since God himself transcends human limits, it is not surprising that his nature cannot be expressed fully by the normal use of language. The fact that God transcends human limitation means that he exceeds what language can convey about him. Scholars debate what Paul meant by the name above every name. Two possibilities prevail: the birth name Yeshua, or the Tetragrammaton, the unspoken name of the one God of Israel. So we'll be looking at these two possibilities.
Hello?
Papa? Yes, I'm in the middle of my class, Papa. Papa. I'm in the middle of my class right now. I'm live on the internet.
Okay, don't worry about it.
You know. Again, sorry for that delay. We had an issue here, but we will work on that. So there's two possibilities for what Paul is talking about as the name above every names. Either it's the name Yeshua, the personal name that the Messiah bore in his life on earth, or is the Tetragrammaton, the Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the unspoken name of the one God of Israel. So we'll be looking at these two possibilities. Again, sorry for the background noise and difficulties we had. I am dealing with life issues, and we have distractions being there, especially filming from my home studio here. But we'll continue on and we'll look at this, and I appreciate everyone who is still watching, and we will continue to hone our broadcast as we go on. This is good stuff that we're looking at. So the first possibility is that the name of all names is Yeshua. The first possibility for Paul's name of every name points to the human name of the Messiah, Yeshua. Though Yeshua was a popular name during the first century for many males, scholars who favor this name as the name of every name back their assertion by often citing the divine biblical message through the angel who had visited Yeshua's mother, Miriam. We read about Yeshua's Brit Milah in Luke 2:21, which reads, on the 8th day, when it was time for his Brit Milah, he was given the name Yeshua, which is what the angel had called him before his conception. Biblical scholar C.F.D. Moll asserted that the name Yeshua is the name above every name because it was the human name the Messiah was known by in his incarnation, in his time on earth, and the name he bore in his self-emptying and self-sacrifice. The formerly common human name Yeshua is now exalted like the risen Yeshua himself is now exalted. According to Moll, the common name Yeshua, a name which was common, that there were at this time there were thousands, 10,000, because of Yeshua bearing the common name Yeshua in his life on earth and in his sacrificial death for atonement, that the name Yeshua became exalted and will be the name that all humanity will acknowledge as the name of the one who is above all names. The divine Yeshua, who came into the world as a servant through his sacrifice, turned this common name into the one which all creation will one day bow and acknowledge, the lordship of the bearer. We can see an expanded version of the above points in this progression. God in verse 6, then in second, a Yeshua who, without ceasing to be truly and fully God, became truly man. Furthermore, he experienced death. In particular, a death of shame and rejection on a cross, verse 8. From beginning to end, there was continuity of person, for it was Yeshua the Messiah, verse 5, who was in the form of God. Just as at the other end of the process, it was Yeshua who received the name which is above every name, and to whom every tongue will yet confess. So for those who see that the name above all names is the name Yeshua, they use the reasoning, one, it was a divinely given name, that the name Yeshua was given to Miriam by the angel who told her of the coming of the Messiah in her womb. So in that being there was a divinely given name, that the name above all names is Yeshua, because of that it was given, he was given, though it was a common name, it was given to him to bear in his life on earth, and therefore it will be the name that all of the created order will one day acknowledge as Lord of all. And there are also those who another reason seeing that the name Yeshua was exalted by it being born by the Messiah, that in him, in his life, his death, and his resurrection, he transformed the common name into a name that will be the greatest name, that will be the name above all name. The other possibility is the Tetragrammaton. The name above all name is the Yud He Vav He, the unspoken name of the one God of Israel. And Archelaus Solon, a biblical scholar, suggested that in the Jewish context of Paul's writing, the name above every name was the Tetragrammaton, the unspoken name of the one God of Israel. And Solon sees that the name of all names is the unspoken name of the one God of Israel. And he continues saying the Tetragrammaton comes from the Greek Tetragrammaton, meaning consisting of 4 letters, which is the Yud He Vav He in Hebrew. It is the 4-letter biblical name of the one God of Israel. And such a view upholds the highest form of Christology, declaring Yeshua's place within the one God of Israel, consistent with the Tanakh. Solon continues, Paul identifies the first person of the Trinity as the one who gives the divine name. The second person is the one who receives it. And the third person is the one who awakens its acknowledgement and glorification. While this text does not explicitly mention the Holy Spirit, the Spirit's activity is implied by the universal acclamation of Yeshua as Lord, which Paul elsewhere says is possible only as a work of the Spirit. So interesting here that though this passage speaks specifically about Yeshua and his place in the one God of Israel, that also we see that Solon here is actually bringing together the idea of the triune God of Israel, saying that there's implied in this the Spirit, the Ruach Kodesh, being that as we know from what Paul's writings, that you cannot acknowledge Yeshua as Lord without the empowerment and the work of the Spirit. It is the power of the Ruach Kodesh. The Ruach Kodesh gives us the ability to acknowledge Yeshua as Lord and Master. So though unseen in this passage, the Ruach Kodesh is here in the affirmation that anyone who affirms Yeshua as Lord, they do it by the Ruach Kodesh, by the Spirit of God. As we'll see in verse 10 and 11, we will look at tomorrow, the bearer of the name above every name, Yeshua the Messiah, will receive universal acknowledgement and worship as the sovereign ruler of all creation. For a Jew such as Paul, this universal worship will belong only to the one God of Israel, who is the sole one worthy to bear the Tetragrammaton, the unspoken name of God. As a devout Jew, Paul would only would acknowledge that this name above all names applies only to the one God of Israel. So in this we see that there is the understanding in both those who developed and wrote this hymn, and also as Paul using here that there is a deep understanding of Yeshua as being one with the one God of Israel, and that he is the bearer of the name of the one God of Israel, and shares in all that there is to be the Lord of all creation, the one who is the only one to be worshipped, the only one to be worshipped, as is said with Paul, as a devout Jew, is the one God of Israel. So Paul understood that the God of Israel is the sole one to bear the tetragrammaton, the unspoken name of the one God of Israel. Therefore, we see that this name of every name must be the divine name. N.T. Wright, a biblical scholar, saw a definite connection between Yeshua as Messiah, also being Kyrios, Lord, which Kyrios is the Greek word for Lord. Coming from the ancient Greek word Kyrios, meaning Lord or Master. And Wright points out that it appears 740 times in the Brit Hadashah, and usually refers to Yeshua. In addition, Wright asserted Yeshua's direct reference to the one God of Israel, where he wrote in Philippians 2:6-11, if Jesus has now been exalted to share the very throne of God, the God who, as Isaiah 45:23 declares, will not share his glory with another, then this Jesus must have been, from all eternity, somehow or other, equal with God. So we see that this understanding of who the bearer of the divine name is, that we know that it is Yeshua the Messiah, that he is the one. And we have here, as I said, there are two different opinions on what this name of all names is in reality, whether it is the common name Yeshua, the name that he bore in his humanity in this world, or would be the divine name. And both ways of understanding have validity, and both are important ways to understand who this is. We have those who hold to the divine name, the name above all name, being Yeshua, the name that was given by the angels, the name that was exalted by the one who bore it, by the one who lived under the name Yeshua, transforming the name into the name which all humanity, the whole created order, both within the heavenlies, within earth, and under the earth, all will acknowledge that Yeshua is Lord. And there's also, as I said, those who see it as the divine name, especially given that this passage here, this passage, Philippians 2:6-11, the Messianic hymn, has underpinnings connecting it to Isaiah 45:23, which is clearly a passage speaking about Yud-Heh-Vav, the one God of Israel, speaking about that he is the one, only one, to which worship and the bending of knees is due. So we see that also that there is a deep understanding that in this name of all names that Yeshua bears, that it is the divine name, it is the unspoken name of the one God of Israel that will be acknowledged by all the world, that he is the one Lord, and Yeshua has taken his place as the one to be the bearer of this name. So that will conclude how I was only going to look at verse 8 today, and we ended up moving into verse 9, so we'll be looking at verse 10 tomorrow, and possibly going into verse 11 tomorrow and completing the Messianic hymn. But I thank you for watching our broadcast today as we continue going through Paul's letter to Philippi, and this is the Letter to Philippi live broadcast. My name is Sean Emslie. I am your teacher, and we'll continue our study going through the Messianic hymn. We'll be looking at Philippians chapter 2:10, and actually, as I did yesterday, I'll pre-read verses 10 and 11 so we can get an idea what we'll be looking at tomorrow. And verse 10 reads, that in honor of the name given Yeshua, every knee will bow in heaven, on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will acknowledge that Yeshua the Messiah is Adonai, to the glory of God the Father. So thank you for watching, and we will be continuing tomorrow, as always, at 12 p.m. Pacific Time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 p.m. Jerusalem Time, for the Letter to Philippi live broadcast. And this is an initiative of Letter to Philippi. You can go to lettertophilippi.org to find out more about our work. We have recordings of our previous broadcasts that you can either watch or listen to the broadcast. We have a link to purchase my Messianic commentary on Philippians. You can leave a prayer request, as we say that prayer is very important, and we will see that in chapter 4, verse 6, where the Apostle Paul expresses that we show our dependence on God daily by bringing all things to God in prayer. And I want to be praying for you, so you can leave a prayer request there on our website, and we would really appreciate it if you also consider making a contribution to keep this work going. We are a new nonprofit organization, and we're looking to continue to grow this work, to add new initiatives, and also looking to eventually have live gatherings in person as we move out of the digital world, and also expand into the real world outside of our phones and computers. But for now, we have the daily Letter to Philippi live broadcast, and we'll be adding new initiatives as time goes by. And you can find out more at lettertophilippi.org. And thank you for watching, and I will see you tomorrow at noon Pacific Time as we look at verses 10 and possibly verse 11 of chapter 2 of Philippians. Again, lettertophilippi.org. And my name is Sean Emslie, and thank you for watching, and we will see you tomorrow. And